All right, hello everyone. Welcome to another alternate media special. My name is Bradley, and this is going to be the first in a series that I'm going to be doing on the Old Testament. Um, this is predominantly going to be for Patreon, so for those of you watching YouTube, this will probably be the only one that gets uploaded. And it's just to give you a little bit of a taste, and hopefully inspire you to maybe become one of our patrons at our Patreon. It's not going to be as professionally produced. It's not going to be even as professional in the atmosphere. What I intend for this to be is kind of like you just hanging out with me while I study the Torah and kind of elucidate my thoughts on it, and any thoughts that may pop through my head. So this should be a lot of fun, I hope. We are going to be starting in Genesis 1, which is my favorite chapter. So to get right in, pour yourself a drink. Usually we've got some couple of glasses of whiskey. I actually have some beer with me right now because it's a Monday, and I'm not trying to go that hard. But I will be reading from the Schottenstein edition of the Chumash because it is interlinear. So I'll be reading the English, and where it's important, I may outline some of the Hebrew that is also there. I may even read a little bit from the commentary here and there to kind of give you guys a feel for what it's like to read a piece of Jewish literature. And also give you some of the enlightenment that there is to gain from such literature. So, I guess to begin, we all know typically how Genesis 1:1 reads. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. I'm probably going to spend a lot of time just on this one verse. The way that this translation reads is, in the beginning of God's creating the heavens and the earth. So in Hebrew, that would be Bereshit bara Elohim et hashamayim vet haaretz. That is important. So you notice it says, in the beginning of God's creating, rather than in the beginning God created. There's a few reasons for this. Now, if you read, which I spent a little bit today reading some of the commentaries. Rashi's commentary is a good one, and I tend to agree a little more with Rashi's on this subject. I also read a little bit of Ramban on it. I tend to agree a lot with Ramban on most things, but this is one where I agree with Rashi a little more, and that's the word Bereshit. It is in construct form, and the precedence for that is overwhelming in its many, many, many uses all throughout the Torah and the prophets and the writings. So it doesn't necessitate that the verse is chronological. You think in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth, so it's telling me that these are the first two things that were created, is how we would typically understand it. But it's not. If you wanted to make a chronological statement, the proper Hebrew word, as Rashi points out, would have been Berishana, which means basically at first God created, the heavens and the earth. But that is not what is used. What is used is Bereshit. Now, Ramban still builds a case that it's chronological, even though the use of the word Bereshit is there. Now, what he bases this on, I would tend to think would be the exception. He bases it on a handful of verses where the word Bereshit is being used, and it is not indicative of being construct form. Whereas Rashi's case that it is construct form is being built entirely on the majority of its uses throughout the Old Testament. So if we're going to go on precedence alone, I would say I tend to agree with Rashi that this is not a chronological statement. And that will come out a little more as we go further. When you read the next verse, Your English translations probably say, "Now the earth was formless and void, and darkness was over the surface of the waters, and the Spirit of God hovered over the surface of the deep." Something like that. Their translation here goes, uh, "When the earth was astonishingly empty, with darkness upon the surface of the deep, and the presence of the divine hovered upon the surface of the waters." Okay, so you understand the way that that reads, okay? We read, "In the beginning of God's creating the heavens and the earth, when the earth was astonishingly empty, with darkness on the surface of the deep." So it's not saying that heaven and earth were necessarily the first things created, and verse 2 really gives us the reason. Water was present, apparently, so to necessarily say that heaven and earth were the first things created, it's like, okay, well, then where did the water come from? And there are several rabbis that wrestle with that question, and I believe Or HaChaim, if I'm not mistaken, I may be misquoting him, comes to the conclusion that, basically the elements and the materials necessary to create heaven and earth were created at the same time that heaven and earth were created. Obviously, in order for those to exist, then the matters that they're made from have to exist. But the importance of Bereshit not being chronological. Bereshit, as it reads in the text, it's grammatically incorrect, being that it is in construct form. Okay, it does read as "in the beginning of," dot dot dot. In the beginning of, God created the heavens and the earth. There's this thing that appears like it's missing. I'm not saying that there's a word that's missing from the Bible. That's certainly not true. This text, at least the Hebrew text that I have in front of me, more or less is 100% accurate with, or at least 99 point something percent accurate with all of the oldest manuscripts that exist today. So there is no word missing from the text, but the way it reads is almost as though there is. What you would get is, "In the beginning of, God created the heavens and the earth," which is why they have translated it "in the beginning of God's creating the heavens and the earth." And there's a very popular rabbi in Judaism. His name is Rabbi Lawrence Kellerman. He does a video called "A Rational Approach to the Divinity of the Oral Tradition," or a rational approach to the divine origin of the oral tradition. The whole first 20 minutes is basically him going over this verse and the importance of that word Bereshit. And I'm not going to spoil it all for you, but the importance of it really is that grammatical error. Rashi believes that these grammatic errors that exist all throughout the Torah, because they do exist all throughout the Torah, Rashi only commented on verses that he deemed unreadable. They didn't make any sense, at least not in proper Hebrew. And that would be either due to a spelling error or the wrong tense of the word being in the verse, exactly like here. It's in construct form where it shouldn't be, if what it's indicating is a chronological sequence of events. And so he didn't view these to be mistakes. He thought that they were hints or clues at a deeper meaning underlying the text. And so Bereshit becomes an important word because it's the first word of the first book of the first chapter of the first verse of the Bible, and it's already technically incorrect. So we begin the Bible with a hint at something deeper. And what is concluded from the majority of all of the other times that the word Bereshit or Reshit is used is that most of the times that it's used in the Torah, it is in reference to either the people of Israel or the commandments of the Torah. And it is in fact it's one of the terms that is used for the commandments of the Torah. in that Proverbs 8, I believe it is, refers to the beginning of God's ways. That word beginning of his ways is Reshit. And the ways of God are the Torah. And so if the Torah is the beginning of his ways, then that's one of the synonymous meanings with the word Reshit. And so we come here and we read Bereshit, God created the heavens and the earth. So what you're reading is it can either be, as Rashi surmised, that it can either be with the children of Israel, God created the heavens and the earth. That doesn't make any sense. But with the Torah, God created the heavens and the earth. That may seem like it doesn't make sense at first. And that's if you are thinking of the Torah in terms of, the commandments that exist in the written Old Testament. And for sure that's what the Torah is, but the Torah is more than that. The Torah is the beginning of his ways. It is the very perfect will of God. And the written form is written for our sake, so we have something relatable to comprehend the nature of God. Because each commandment really does teach us something about God's nature, and that's important because it teaches us how to be godly. So with the Torah, God created the heavens and the earth. This is paramount in understanding John 1:1. Okay, because we read, in the beginning was the Word. Okay, this is so important. Because you have, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. We're getting an idea of the beginning of Jesus, or Yeshua. Most of my followers at this point, at least the ones that I expect to be patrons, probably know that I refer to him as Yeshua more often than not. On my TikToks, I'll say Jesus because I'm addressing more Christians in that audience. But for my Messianic friends and Jewish friends, Yeshua will be what I more often say. So John 1:1 is kind of outlining, the beginning of Yeshua, and it refers to him as the Word. Okay, the Word is what? I get the Greek word is logos, but I don't appeal a lot to the Greek text. It's nice and it is useful, but none of the apostles spoke Greek. Or likely they didn't. Paul might have been the one who spoke the most Greek, and even he was referred to as a cherry picker because his Greek was very broken. Yeshua almost certainly did not speak Greek on a regular basis. Hebrew was the language of their religion, and so Hebrew is what is important for us to focus on. So when it says that he is the Word, in the beginning was the Word, we've got that same phrase, in the beginning. Okay, we're seeing thematic repetition, which the thematic repetition pervades all of the Bible, and so when you come to John 1:1, you read, "In the beginning was the Word." That's intended to, tickle our brain a little bit and say, "Hey, yeah, let's go back to Genesis," because that's where the clue of what I'm referring to is going to be, and that's where we have here, because Yeshua is the living Word, which is to say the living Torah. Okay, he is the Torah. If the Torah had a physical body and was able to walk and talk and live a human life, that is what he is. So, Paul says the essence of godliness in bodily form. That's the Torah made flesh right there, because that's what the Torah is the essence of godliness in written form. And so when you take that and you put it into a physical body, in the beginning was the Word. With the Word, God created the heavens and the earth. With the Torah, God created the heavens and the earth. This is paramount because we see in verse 2, the earth was formless and void. Formless and void, or as this says, astonishingly empty, with darkness upon the surface of the deep. The word there, tohu vabohu, would be the formless and void, and the idea there, darkness being over the surface of the deep. The earth at this point is not in its complete form. It's almost as though matter was present, but in a state of chaos. Especially, we see darkness hovered over the surface of the deep, and this is a reference to waters. So water existed, and water, in all forms of philosophy, is almost always synonymous with chaos. Um, and uh, Darkness itself. Now, this word for darkness is not necessarily a negative term. Um, Matter of fact, in let's see, the Hebrew word vahoshek. So that is used a plethora of different ways in all of Scripture. It's actually one of the same words used in Exodus for the thick, tangible darkness that was put over Egypt in a plague. Um, it's also, and I may be mistaken here, but I'm pretty sure it's the same word that's used for the thick darkness that Moses had to walk into to commune with God and receive the commandments. Um, and so, there we see darkness hovered over the surface of the waters, and the Spirit of God hovered over the surface of the deep. We're getting a very similar image to that example of Moses going up the mountain and entering the thick darkness. So it's not inherently negative. It is, at some points in the Bible, used in a negative sense. As kind of a frightening darkness. But it's not inherently so. And as we see the first time that it's used there, it is right in the middle of water being over the surface of the deep. Well, not over the surface of the deep, but water being covering the face of the earth at this point. So the earth being in a state of chaos, but then over that, the Spirit of God hovers. And I think there's an important lesson in that all on its own. But continuing, let's see, the presence of the divine hovered over the surface of the waters. It's interesting, actually. There are some rabbis who point out that heaven is made of two elements. Because when we talk about the matter from which all of creation was created, obviously we see water in this example. But there are some of the rabbinic commentators who point out that of the four elements, because there are only four, there is, earth, water, wind, fire. I understand that to some of you that may seem a little new age. But understand there's nothing new under the sun, and the elements are what they are, in as much as the points of the compass are what they are, and the stars are located where they are. Just because they exist, the pagans don't necessarily get a claim over them. Especially when it's, it is something that God himself established first. So, of the elements, there are some rabbinic commentators that point out that heaven is made of fire and water. And the reason being that if you separate the word for heaven, shamayim, it is made of Aish, which is fire, and Mayim, which is water. So, Shemayim being the word for heavens, it is plural. So, Mayim would be waters, plural. Just a neat little factoid there. I completely forgot where I was going with that, so disregard. But starting in verse 3, God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. So, Vayomer Elohim, Yehi Or, Vayehi Or. So, Vayomer Elohim, this is, and God said. The important thing about this, and what you'll notice throughout, I want you to catalog, this is the first time that we read that in this chapter. It's understood in Judaism that there are 10 words of creation, 10 statements of creation where God says, "Let there be," and so it happens. And so this is the first time we see that happen. That the Vayomer Elohim, that is God said, and you'll see that throughout the whole of Torah. Anytime that God speaks to someone or that He makes a declaration, it's Vayomer Elohim, and then the rest of what He says. So Vayomer Elohim Yihi Or, that is, let there be light. Or is the Hebrew word for light, for those of you who are wondering. Vayehi Or, and light was. I guess in my own interpretation, from my understanding of Hebrew, how I would translate that is that God said, or literally, if I translate this literally, said God, because Vayomer, and said God, Yehi Or, and said God, let there be light is good. It's an interesting word because it almost reads as it reads almost as though it says, and said God, light become, and light became. It's kind of the way that reads in my mind. And God saw the light was good, and God separated between light and between darkness. So this is important because understanding at this point, the earth is in a state of chaos, and by that I mean it's there. There was no form to it, and being void at this point. The idea is that it's a big mix up of absolutely everything. There's no order to it. It's like the matter for what became heaven and earth existed, but it had no form. There was no organization to it. It was just there. And so when God created light, boom, there was light in there in the midst of it. And so you had like this big mix up of light and darkness. And that's why it says that He separated the light from the darkness, is because prior to Him separating them, they were just kind of in this big mix up of matter and light and darkness, and water. And so God separated the light from the darkness. Let's see. God called the light day, and darkness He called night. And there was evening, and there was morning, one day. And it's important that it says one day, not day one. A lot of your translations probably say day one or the first day. Day one is not exactly inaccurate, but there's a reason that they say one day here, because the word used here is echad, just like in the Shema. Shema Yisrael, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad, God is one. So it's to establish that this is exactly one day, or if you want to take it literally, it's a literal one day, 124-hour period, as far as what we know a day to be. And that's one of the other things I find interesting about this, is that it says evening and morning were the first day, but it says that the light He called day and the darkness He called night. Now, I understand at this point the sun has not been created, so the source of physical light doesn't exist, and I think that's really worth pointing out, because it's not necessarily a physical light that we're talking about, but rather true light and true darkness. What we physically view is for us to relate the concept, if that makes sense. So the word light, and we use it in so many different contexts in the 21st century, especially in English-speaking countries, So there's light like the light that's illuminating this room right now. But there is also the sense of light in like the sense of being enlightened when you have come to a knowledge that you didn't previously have, And when something is being kept from you, if there's information that's being kept from you by others, we say that we're in the dark about it because we've not become enlightened to whatever this information is. And so light means many things in this aspect, and so there's a true meaning of what light is, and that's the light that was created is true light. We are given the physical visible light, like the bulbs that are illuminating this room, so that we can relate within ourselves what light actually is. Because what does it do is it orients us. And again, there we have a reference back to verse 1. With the Torah, God created the heavens and the earth. Because that's what the Torah does, is it orients our lives, it centers our lives, and gives them a sense of organization. That's what the commandments are, is we don't have to wonder what is a righteous act to do, what is a sinful act to do. The Torah tells us these things. It's not a mystery. We're not in the dark about it. And so if you think in terms of physical light and physical darkness, when you're in a dark room, you have no idea where to go. Because you have no idea where you are in relation to, the coffee table, the bed frame. We all know how horrible it is to have a bed frame meet your shin. But yeah, that's the sense of disorganization you get, and disorienting darkness can be. And so light is orienting. When the lights come on, we can see everything in the room, so we can navigate our way around it. It orients us, it centers us, and helps us to know where we are in retrospect to the grander scheme of things. And so that would be the true light. I mean, really just extrapolate that out as far as you need to understand what true light actually is. That would be the light that was created. Physical light, I would say, probably wasn't created until the sun was created. And you can ask, okay, so why then? Why then is light called day and darkness night? Because we have those terms, right? We have day and night, and nighttime is dark and daytime is light. And that's the important of that's the important of really of the Hebrew here. So let's see. Vayikra Elohim, God called. Leor Yom, God called the light day. Velachoshek Kara La'ilah. So darkness he called night. Okay, so La'ilah or Layla. Layla is a name. Layla also means night, as in nighttime. In Hebrew, it would be like La'ilah. And then it says, and there was evening. Evening is Erev. So La'ilah and Erev they're not the same word. So what we read in the passage is that evening and morning were the first day. So the time period that we call a day, like a 24-hour day, consists of evening and morning. Night is never mentioned. And I almost think that's important because there's a point in the Gospels where Yeshua says, we must work while it is still day, for night is coming when no man can work. And he's not talking about, he's not talking about nighttime. He's talking about a period that is soon to come. And I think in most circles that is actually acknowledged as being a reference to eschatology and like the end times, which I would wager to say is pretty accurate. Especially in Judaism, end times is understood in the frame of reference of the book of Maccabees and the reign of Antiochus Epiphanes, where Torah and Judaism was outlawed entirely. You could not obey the Torah. He made an anti-Torah. If the Torah said to do something, it was illegal to do that. And if the Torah said don't do something, then if you were caught going out of your way not to do it, then that was punishable. And most times by death. It was pretty horrible, actually, comparable to the Holocaust. Um, and I think in some circles they might even say worse so. Um, and so this is if we're to understand our duty to God, and how we serve Him, the work that we do to Him, the work that we do for Him to be the commandments of the Torah, then night is coming when no man can work. This is an important thing to understand, because it would be a reference to such a time where the commandments of the Torah are then outlawed. And so I think in terms of day and night as we know them, that really falls into evening and morning, whereas the day and night here are much like light and dark. These are grander concepts of what's being spoken about. I don't necessarily think it means day in the same sense that we understand it. Otherwise, it would be a redundancy to say that this was the first day later on. So that's just my thoughts on that. I guess we'll move on beyond that, though. I don't want to. I intended to be so much farther in this at this point in the video. God said, "Let there be a firmament in the midst of the waters, and let it separate between water and water." This, as Ramban states, this is single-handedly the most mystical verse in all of the Torah. And actually, so what he says is that if you read it and you understand it in its mystical context outright, then you are forbidden from teaching it. If you read it and you do not understand it, you're forbidden from seeking it out. It may seem a little bit extreme, but this verse is it's deep. It's ironic I say it's deep because you're talking about water and water. I mean, what do you mean separating water from water? And verse 7. So God made the firmament. He separated between the waters which were beneath the firmament and the waters which were above the firmament, and it was so. So you've got this idea. So there's a firmament that's separating water from water, and you've got this idea of, okay, so you've got water below. I guess we can accept that that's the water that we have here on Earth if we're talking in physical terms. But then, so that means that there's water like that that's above the firmament. Now, does that go beyond the span of what we call outer space into almost another realm? Which biblically, so we'll get into this later, actually. But there are different realms that are recognized in Judaism, 4 to be exact, or worlds, or dimensions. Well, I guess dimensions is something different because Judaism acknowledges 10 dimensions, but there are 4 worlds, and we'll get into those a little more in chapter 2 because it becomes a little more relevant in chapter 2. So I'll give you a clue as to what's going on there, probably when we finish what I'm going to do here. So you've got this idea. If we're talking physically, we have physical waters below. So where are the physical waters above? I mean, it's got to be water, right? Because Hebrew is a specific language, very specific. In one of my TikToks, I go over Leviticus 18:22 to explain that it's not talking about pedophilia per se. It somewhat addresses pedophilia, but it's not front and center in that verse, because Hebrew is specific. There's a Hebrew word for an adolescent boy For a youth, a young man, there's a separate word. For a full-grown man, there's a separate word, and the same thing for women. There are three different words for human beings of each gender. So really, you're talking six words there at different stages of development and different ages. And so, you've got some who theorize that it's talking about an ice layer outside of the atmosphere, or a vapor layer, or what have you. But there would be a different Hebrew word for all of those. The fact that it uses the same word, ma'im, waters, if we understand it in physical terms, then it has to be the same substance of water that exists above. And we just don't have an example of that anywhere in the physical realm, as far as we know. So if we are following suit with what we have up to this point, there is a truer, deeper meaning to these concepts, and certainly there are physical counterparts to them. So yeah, water certainly existed, and I would concede it probably is physical water, because dry land is caused to come out of it later, and we'll see that as we move on. But as far as the water that is above, water below and water above, and the firmament between, I don't know that I have a right answer on that. I tend to, I guess, agree with Ramban that it's just to wrap your head around what that verse is saying, it could drive you crazy. So don't go crazy trying to figure it out. If you read it and you get it, then you get it. If you read it and you don't get it, then just move on. Move on and hope that you get it next time. Let's see. Where were we? Picking up verse 8. God called the firmament heaven. Shamaim. So, heavens, plural, really. Which is another interesting thing, because if we're speaking in chronological terms from the first verse, as some of the sages, as Ramban said, then heaven already existed before this point. But we see at this point, then heaven was also created. So it could be talking about the sky. Sure, I'll grant that it could be talking about the sky or even outer space at that point. And there was evening, and there was morning, a second day. And there again we see evening and morning. That's a pattern you're going to notice throughout, is that there's evening and morning. Verse 9. Vayomer Elohim. This is the second time we're seeing that. Okay, Vayomer Elohim. God said, "Let the waters be gathered beneath the heaven into one area, and let them appear. And let appear the dry land." And it was so. So this is the point at which, if we're taking the previous verses literally, we had a separation of waters, but now we've got a gathering of waters. So there's this idea that either we're talking about two different waters here, or if we're talking about the same water, then which ones were gathered? Is it just the ones that were below, or is it the ones that were above and below, or are these verses really connected that way? But anyway, so the waters are gathered together, and then the dry land is caused to come up from it. That is important to note also. God doesn't create the dry land, he causes it to come up from the water. This is important because understanding what happened in the beginning. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. So everything that exists, the potential for it, all existed, boom, right there in that first part. All of it. Nothing that is created beyond this point is actually created. It is all brought forth, or it is caused to come to. But none of it is created ex nihilo, because everything technically was already created. So, we said that it was formless, it was disorganized, it was disoriented. So now all we're really doing is we're sifting through and we're organizing stuff. This is the dry land being brought out of the ocean. And that fact, remember that fact, that nothing was created after the initial creation. The initial creation was everything, and then everything else is just it's brought forth or it's brought to, because that's going to become very important when we come to the creation of man, because we are created separately from the rest of creation. We are created using the same materials as the creation, but we are a different creation. Um, and we'll go more into that as we go on. I really think this is probably a good stopping point. I've gone a little longer than I intended to, but we made it all the way up to, I'll go through to verse 10. God called the dry land earth. Eretz is earth in Hebrew. And the gathering of waters he called seas. So I referenced earlier, and I said that I would get to it, that there's going to be some relevance to the idea of there being realms in Judaism, and the differences between chapter 1 and 2. And we haven't quite gotten to it yet. We've just barely touched on the order of creation. But there exists in Judaism the idea that the Garden of Eden was not located on the earth, that it was located in a separate realm entirely. And so, with that bombshell, I'm going to call it quits here, and you'll have to subscribe to the Patreon and follow along if you want to see where that goes. This has been awesome, and I'm grateful for all of you for joining me. I hope it hasn't been too awkward. This is my first time doing solo in front of a camera where I've got to look right at you guys. So, anyway, I am gonna call it quits. Shalom. Bless everyone.